News, views, voices of the global Indian community. India abroad.
My only challenge is, Vivek, is how do we get the Republican Party to cooperate with us? I mean, they need a gender change or something. But the reason that we are where we are is that there's no opposition party to the Marxist left.
Yeah, look, I don't disagree with you. I will say that this year presents a unique opportunity for that. I'll tell you why. So I've been saying this for a year and a half. Back when I was saying this in April of last year, it was deemed a conspiracy theory. Now the very people who called it a conspiracy theory acknowledge it's a reality, that Joe Biden is likely at this point not even going to be the nominee. I said this a year and a half ago, it's obvious today. And I think this presents an opportunity for us, because we don't know who they're going to put up now. Right? But the question is, who they put up, it doesn't matter, actually. We obsess over that too much. We obsessed over the radical Biden agenda. We got a red wave that never came in 2022. I think the way we're going to succeed in saving this country and in a practical sense in winning this upcoming election, dare I say it, in a landslide, is by forgetting what the left puts up on offer, which puppet they put up to replace Biden. He's not even really the president of the United States, after all. It's a puppet for the managerial class. Instead of focusing on them, focus on who we are and what we actually stand for. Offer an actual alternative vision of our own. And I think it's been a very long time since we've done that. And that's a big part of the purpose of the speech I gave here today. These are topics I have not yet really covered in much of my public commentary. That's going to change in the months and years ahead. Because I believe we have to understand not only what we support, but why we actually stand for it, especially in the tough cases where the rubber hits the road. And so that's what we're missing in the conservative movement. We can't just be against what the left puts up. We have to offer an alternative vision of our own. And I think the future direction of this country is a fusion of that libertarian nationalist vision that both protects our national identity, but dismantles the regulatory state in a way that our founding fathers envisioned. Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Vivek, good comments on legal immigration, but I want to call you on something. You danced around the critical question, which is in legal immigration, how many? How many? And currently, before Biden blew things up, we were taking 1.1 to 1.2 million a year. And what would be your number of legal immigrants, keeping in mind that just family reunification, that is husband marrying wife, brings in 250,000 a year, not even the children. So right there, unless you're going to deny American the right to bring in his spouse, you have 250,000 immigrants every year.
So I want to make sure I heard, because you're saying legal or illegal. The right number for illegal immigration is 0. I think we're not stopping until we get that job done. On legal immigration, the answer is going to be less, but I think the question of what number is the wrong question to ask, respectfully. I think the right question to ask is, what is the quality of immigrants we want? Do you demonstrate civic loyalty to this country? Are you willing to abandon citizenship to any other nation? Citizenship's really about loyalty, other than this one. Do you adopt English and embrace it as the national language? Do you demonstrate an understanding of the ideals enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution? Do you have a demonstrated commitment to work hard to be able to actually advance the interests of American citizens? The sole purpose of U.S. immigration policy should be to advance the interests of U.S. citizens. So if the number of immigrants who meet that criteria is 0, then the answer is going to be 0. If the number of immigrants who meet that criteria is in excess of the number proposed in whatever congressional bill is floating around on a given day, then it may be in excess of that. But I think the right question has to focus on the quality of those immigrants. It will, on a pragmatic note, almost certainly mean vastly less immigration than the status quo. A lot of the chain migration, the spousal case is the hard case. A lot of chain migration has nothing to do with spouses coming over. It's distant family members coming over as part of chain migration. The number of asylum applications, refugee applications, and humanitarian goals, I think all of that really goes out the window for a proper immigration policy that asks what type of immigration advances the interests of the U.S. citizens who are already here. And the failure of current policies is that in many cases we're not getting certain immigrants who have been actually crowded out by the otherwise backlog process that could add value to the immigrants who are here. But we're letting in far more who actually do erode both our national identity as well as even our own national security. That's the way I view it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ramaswamy. I very much agree with your policy proposal to decouple from China, but I wanted to pick your brain on the reality that in the status quo, our sanctions regime and various mechanisms we would probably use to decouple from China rely upon broad statutes, and how much that would be undercut by cases like Loper Bright, West Virginia, insofar as they circumscribe the executive's ability to interpret those statutes and rule-make to then decouple from China.
So you're saying there's a tension between curbing the power of the executive versus actually taking the steps required to declare independence from China?
Yeah, like for example, IEPA, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, very broad statute. And the question is, if we are going to buy your whole view on the administrative state,
Yeah.
do you think it's possible we can pass new statutes that are specific enough to decouple from China?
And it's a great form of question, because you could ask that same form of question also fighting illegal immigration, because how much more are you going to get done through DHS if DHS is much more constrained in its ability to interpret the law? So this cuts both ways, admittedly. Here's my view on it. First of all, there's a difference between two types of executive action. Executive actions taken by the person who we the people elect to run the government, that's the US president, versus executive actions that are taken by administrative agencies that nobody ever actually elected to that office. So when I talk about shutting down the deep state, I'm not talking about eliminating the presidency. I'm talking about making sure the president of the United States is actually the one taking the executive action rather than unelected bureaucrats underneath him. And the scope of the Supreme Court decisions in, for example, you want to take Loper, which was overturned Chevron deference. What that said is these administrative agencies no longer enjoy deference in their actual interpretation of the law. So if you separate that for what a strong US president is able to do within the bounds of law versus what many of these agencies have been doing, which is outside the bounds of law, I think that maps out the path forward. Strong president acts, unelected bureaucrats and the agencies don't. And that's my answer.
Any follow up or?
Briefly, but I want to be respectful of the other questions.
But how do you respond to that, to SEAL law, for example, which basically held that unless you are a multi-member agency like the FTZ, you basically have to be under presidential purview. And Wilbur Bright does not think makes a distinction between presidential rulemaking, or agencies under presidential control rulemaking, and independent agency rulemaking. So, like, I don't know if this is actually true.
Yeah, so it'll be right for the Supreme Court. I mean, this is work on bleeding edge terrain. But my view is, to make it really simple for a broad audience watching online and everything else, is the people we elect to run the government are no longer the ones who actually run the government. And on my view, we restore power to the people who we the people elect with the backstop of democratic accountability, including the US president, to effectuate the laws. But that means we have to dismantle the three-letter agency apparatus that sits underneath him. In the current Supreme Court rulings, that's really the center of gravity of where they've taken the power back and given it back to the people. That'd be my answer to your question. Thank you.
So I'm going to add a dimension that I think complicates the distinction you want to make. To onshore industries that are vital to our security also means protecting jobs with the skills vital to our national security. And that means protecting jobs not just in current plants or current industries, but in future industries to which those skills are relevant. So I think some of the contrast, because you actually have to, if you want to have those people working in America doing those vital tasks, even some of them we don't know what they are, you actually do have to protect jobs and protect wages, not just supply chains and manufacturers.
So look, I think that my goal of the speech today was to lay out a contrast where the view, other than the one I am advancing, is still one I respect. I think you raised a valuable point. But if there's one point you leave this discussion with that we're having here today, is that there is no free lunch with respect to what we're trading off when we do. Right? When you talk about the competitiveness of American manufacturers and onshoring to the United States, that should be the first and best option for any of our supply chains. But if we view it as an urgent need, and I do, to be able to, for example, decouple from China, then that is necessarily going to mean, if you view that as the top priority that the gentleman who asked the last question believes it is as well, that is in the near term going to require nearshoring in combination with onshoring as well. And so it's a question of prioritization. Same thing with the regulatory state. Do we need more vocational and trade education in the United States of America? We do, actually. I think part of the reason we don't have it is in part because of government distortions in the market that have artificially inflated somebody's ability to go become a gender studies major in California, who, when they graduate from college, discover that didn't get them the head start in the American dream they thought it was going to. We cannot, in my view, entrust that same apparatus to somehow be the apparatus that provides us deliverance. I think the best way we're actually going to get there is by first shutting down the regulatory state and getting it out of the way with a shared appreciation for the goals that I think you and I still share in common. So thank you, I appreciate that.
And this will be our last question. Apologies to all.
Hey, Vivek, my name is Success and I just want to say, huge fan of yours. Wanted to ask, why do you think the Minsk Accords failed? And hypothetically, God willing, you become some kind of great advisor or some Secretary of State or some other good position, wonderful position. Do you think you could consider some kind of arrangement where we can get Russia, Ukraine to talk, and maybe America could be a signatory on this kind of agreement? You know, because the Minsk Accords had, Germany, France, and that was all yes, like we're just building up Ukraine.
Well, I didn't cover foreign policy because I think that was probably the one area where there is limited to no daylight between what I think is the national protectionist camp and the national libertarian camp. But since you asked the question about foreign policy, I'll give you what my own perspectives are, and then we'll close this up. My view is the proper U.S. foreign policy is that which advances the interests of American citizens, the same way that I view proper immigration policy. I think a big part of what we've inadvertently done through the neoliberal vision of NATO expansionism, and an interesting week to be talking about this is with the NATO summit happening right here in Washington, D.C., is that we have inadvertently driven Russia further into its alliance with China at a moment where the Russia-China alliance represents the single greatest threat to U.S. security from another nation. So I see right now a historic opportunity to use the ending of the Ukraine war, and I'm in the camp of a pretty hard line on believing that we should not be spending another dime of U.S. taxpayer resources on the war in Ukraine. I don't think we should have spent the first dime in the first instance. And that's different even from some who may have positions that say, well, the ROI of those dollars has not been good enough for the U.S. taxpayer. I agree with that, but that's not my reason for doing it. My reason is that we shouldn't intervene in this war in the first place because not only is it the low ROI of the dollars, we're actively driving Russia further into its military alliance with China. We can use the end of the Ukraine war as a catalyst to negotiate a reasonable deal that, among other things, would require Russia to weaken, if not exit, its military alliance with China. And in return, there will be a reasonable discussion about what land they merge with in Ukraine. And we should demand other things in the context of that negotiation as well. Little known fact is there's a Russian military presence in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in the Western Hemisphere. Get the heck out of our hemisphere would be my view on that matter. So this isn't giving Russia some kind of free pass, but it's looking after our own self-interest. What's the top threat that we face? The Russia-China alliance. What policies have we adopted? Policies that have strengthened that Russia-China alliance. NATO has expanded more after the fall of the USSR than it ever did during the existence of the USSR, which is supposedly the original reason for NATO's existence in the first place. In fact, George Kennan, famous architect of post-Cold War Cold War deterrence, warned in the late 90s that NATO expansionism was one of the greatest and poorest decisions we had made in the post-Cold War era. You have James Baker in 1990 who made a commitment to Gorbachev that we would expand NATO not 1 inch past East Germany, when in fact we look at the 1994 Budapest Memorandum as though it was the 10 Commandments handed on from on high. It wasn't even a treaty. Yet we pay little attention to the not 1 inch commitment that Baker made to Gorbachev in 1990. The right way to set this straight is to, I believe, actually reopen economic relations with Russia, but as a condition for pulling them out of their alliance with China, as Nixon did back with respect to old Maoist China and the USSR. Putin's like the new Mao, and I see an opportunity to actually completely change the bilateral international order, which I believe now favors China, to a trilateral international order where none of the 3 major nuclear superpowers, US, Russia, or China, are allied. And so that's a whole separate discussion for another day that I didn't delve into here, largely because I think the national protectionist and national libertarian views are largely aligned on this question. But what I'll say in closing, in wrapping this up, is, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to use this forum as a chance to air what I believe is an important conversation that refines who we are as a movement and where we're going from here in America First. Donald Trump laid the foundation. He revived it this century. But that America First movement, as I laid out at the beginning of my speech, really began in 2016. In one sense it did, in one sense it actually began in 1776. And I think we still have another 250 years and then some still left yet to go if we revive the principles of our founding in the first place. I do believe that I'm seeing this late in the day, perhaps so many young people in the audience. I do believe that our country right now is, in some sense, everything we've talked about is a symptom of that deeper hunger for a national identity that we're missing today. And I think that that's the root cause, from the invasion of our southern border, to our economic malaise, to our loss of self-confidence, to the erosion of our standing on the global stage. Underlying that, I think, is the largest loss of national self-confidence in the history of our country. And if we're able to fill that void of identity with, to your question, our own vision of who we are, what we stand for, not just as conservatives, but as Americans, then I believe, not in some fake politician way, but in a true way, I actually believe that our best days as a country are actually still ahead of us, that we're not destined to become some backwater relegated to the footnotes of history, an elegant decay of the kind that the United Kingdom went through over the course of the last 250 years, but a nation that is still, like you, young, on its way still to our best days, which may yet be not just years, but centuries ahead of us. That's my hope, and I think the conversation that we began tonight will be part of what gets us there. Thank you, guys. God bless. Thank you.